Hello everybody, how you doing here? Welcome to Chicago, welcome to Lincoln Park. So we're gonna do something different today. I have the comments turned off. We'll let everybody come in here and join, and we'll wait till some people join here. And what we're gonna talk about today is Melungeon history. So we're gonna walk through Lincoln Park here. We have a beautiful 80-degree day, and yeah, what is it? July the 11th, 2025 here. So thanks for tuning in here. I'll mention it a few times as we start our walk here. I got the comments turned off, so people feel free to comment. I'm just going to do my history talk here because for me it's the best way to do it, and we'll give this a try, and then you can watch this in the reruns. I can answer people's comments in the reruns, and we'll go from there. So hey, thanks for tuning in. Welcome to Chicago, welcome to Lincoln Park. We're going to talk about my version of Melungeon history, and I've been researching this for dozens of years here because I have Melungeon ancestry. It's been a great mystery to me. I've had discussions with my aunts and relatives about this and learned a lot from them. If you, like me and like hundreds and thousands of Americans, mainly white Americans from Appalachia, who claim, and there is some kernel of truth to this, I'll talk about it. I don't know why that chime's turning in. It annoys me. We'll just ignore it. And you know, I'm sure many people, this includes Elizabeth Warren, who you know, we all these white people claim to have a long lost indigenous ancestry, and it's murky and we can't prove it. That's why I want to introduce you to Melungeon history. Melungeon history is part of this. It's a hidden part of American history that's not well discussed or covered in history books. What's a Melungeon? It was used as a pejorative in Appalachia, mainly in the 1800s, to describe a mixed race group of people who lived there, that were there when the first settlers, they came with the first settlers, and some of them were there when the Cherokees were there, when the Choctaws, the Chickasaws, the Creeks and the Seminoles, mainly the Creeks and the Cherokees, and even the Catawba, the Native Americans that lived in Appalachia, the Yuchi, several other tribes that I'll get into. We're going to talk about Melungeon history, and for me to talk about Melungeon history and how it affects American history and Native American history, we got to talk about the Spanish exploration of North America that started, of course, with the conquistadors, Christopher Columbus conquering of the Aztecs and the Mayans in Mexico and the Incas in Peru. I'm sure you know about Cortez conquered the Aztecs in 1520s, Pizarro, the Incas in Peru, Machu Picchu, all that stuff. Starting about the same time, I got comments turned off, so please just listen to my historical thing. We're walking through Lincoln Park here, 80 degrees here. We got 12:05 here, July the 11th, 2025. We're talking about Melungeon history. So let's begin. I got some notes here because it's the only way for me to organize this, and hopefully, you know, we'll put this in a book someday or some documentary. I'm just doing the notes here. So Melungeon history in America. You start with Lucas. I'm sure you've heard of Juan Ponce de Leon trying to find the Fountain of Youth in Florida. That, you know, he died. He didn't find the Fountain of Youth. There was the Timucua Indians were in Florida at that time. They largely were destroyed by European diseases. That's why you don't hear about the Timucua. Probably the remnants merged with the Creeks and the Seminoles if they you know, still made it through there. But about the same time, the Spanish tried to, the first attempted that we know of, Spanish trying to settle North America is not St. Augustine. It was this failed expedition by Ayllon, A-Y-L-L-O-N, Lucas Vasquez de Ayllon, A-Y-L-L-O-N, Ayllon. I can't say his name right. I don't speak Spanish. I'm a gringo here. This is 1526. 1526, they attempted to settle the Georgia coast. It was 500, 600 to 700 people. They brought 100 enslaved people with them. Why is this important? Why am I talking about Melungeon history and long lost Cherokee ancestors and, you know, Cherokee princesses and all this stuff that, you know, the Cherokees, their skin crawls when, you know, white Appalachian people like my ancestors, they say, oh, our great-grandmother was full-blooded Cherokee. It's not true. If there's any truth to it, they are distantly related to the mixed blood Cherokees or the Creeks or the Melungeon people, more likely the Melungeon people. Melungeon people exist. They're distinct from the Native Americans. Some of them have Native American ancestry mixed with African, European, and Middle Eastern DNA. Where does this Middle Eastern DNA come in? Well, how did it get to America? When did it get here? It came with the Spanish. It came with the Spanish in the 1500s. The Spanish attempted to settle North America. Several failed expeditions. This is long before Roanoke. This is long before Jamestown and the Pilgrims. This is in the 1500s, okay? And this first expedition, I got the comments turned off so I can do this whole thing. We'll just walk around the North Pond here. Thanks for tuning in. If you miss any of this, you can rewind and start it from the beginning. This is all being recorded here, and it'll go in my live tab here on YouTube. So we're talking about Melungeon history here. 1526, 600 to 700 people attempted to settle the Georgia coast in North America. There were 100 enslaved people. It only lasted 3 months. That's why it's not in your history books. It failed. The leader Aylon, died, and immediately it broke into faction. Some wanted to stay. They had a hard time. They were fighting with the indigenous people. They were starving, just like the Roanoke colony. And the other half wanted to go back to Mexico or Spain. The enslaved people, the 100 enslaved people, realized that they were fighting amongst each other. There's the crime tours. And they they rebelled. They rebelled, and they sided with the people that wanted them to leave. But the Spanish evacuated the Spanish people. They left because they were fighting. The enslaved people were fighting. It was the first documented slave rebellion in the United States, and let me get away from these kids here. They ran into the woods there, and they were marooned there because the Spanish left the enslaved non-indigenous DNA. Spanish. The diseases from the conquistadors spread north from Mexico and the Aztecs. The Aztec Empire and all the surrounding tribes that were not part of it were greatly affected, and disease ravaged the Native American communities first in Mexico. It spread north to North America, and they think 90% of the indigenous population, the original indigenous population of North and South America, was wiped out by European diseases. We know this. We just went through a pandemic. We know the North and South Americans didn't have good immunity to European diseases, mainly brought by the animals that the Europeans brought, horses and pigs and cattle and chickens and stuff, and the decimated indigenous populations. Why is this important? The colonial powers would have not been able to get a foothold in North and South America as easily as they did if it wasn't for the disease wiping out the indigenous populations. This includes when the British and the French came later, but the Spanish and the Portuguese were here first. That chime is probably somebody giving me a gift or something there, or subscribing, and I don't know how to turn it off, so we'll just ignore it here for now because I want to do this historical thing. If you just joined here, we're by the Peggy Nodebart Nature Museum. I'm doing a historical talk about the Melungeons. I got the comments turned off, and bear with me, this is all going somewhere. So what I'm documenting is there were several failed Spanish expeditions that were attempted in North America in the 1500s. Why is this important to the Melungeons? Every one of these expeditions, people were marooned. They were marooned. They were mostly enslaved people from not just Africa. Some of them were for the Middle East. Some of them were the Moors or North Africans or even Turkish people that were enslaved by the Spanish when the Spanish fought the Moors and for the battle for the Iberian Peninsula, the Christians fighting the Islamic empires of North Africa, which in the 1400s were in the southern part of Spain and Italy. I mean, and actually the Yugoslavia area too there was between the Christians and the Islamic empires, the Ottomans and things like that. Look at these little ducks here. So here's the North Pond here. We're on the casting pier. So let me quickly get this going here so I'm not losing everybody. You heard about DeSoto. The DeSoto expedition was about around 1540. You might have heard of the DeSoto car. The DeSoto car is named after, his name was Hernando DeSoto. He died in 1542. He died on the Mississippi River. Why is that? DeSoto was with Pizarro. He was down there in South America when they conquered the Incas. Then he came to North America, and they wanted to do an expedition to explore and looking for the Spanish cities of gold, or the lost cities of gold. They were, you know, what were the Spanish doing here? They were looking for gold, silver, Zacatecas. We know all this. And so DeSoto started in Florida in 1539. He went through Florida, up through Georgia, all the way through South Carolina, North Carolina. What, you know, it didn't exist at the time. It's what the modern states are. Ended up in Tennessee. And they wintered there. They said they brought 240 horses with them. They had about, I don't know, several hundred men there, 400, 600 men they had. And they would capture and what do they call, kidnap Native American people as they went from tribe to tribe, nation to nation. And it would be a daisy chain of interpretation where they would use the indigenous people to interpret. And they were looking for intel on the lost cities of gold, which they never found. And ended up down in northern Alabama. There was a big battle there. There was a huge Native American city, which was probably decimated at that time by European diseases. You heard of Mobile Bay, and there is a Mobile tribe of Indians that ended up with the Creeks there. And it was called the Battle for Albia, Mabilia. It was a major battle between DeSoto's, you know, remember the Spanish had armor, they had harquebuses, they had, you know, early forms of muzzle loaders, kind of, you know, weapons, and they had horses, guns, germs, and steel. Read Diamond's book about guns, germs, and steel, and how, you know, the North and South America was conquered by the Spanish because of that stuff. DeSoto lost a lot of his men in this battle. They were wounded, and so they kind of retreated. They went towards the Mississippi. DeSoto died in the Mississippi and was buried, and his men had a hard time making it back to Mexico and the Spanish colonial cultures there. How does this relate to the Melungeons? They spread diseases. Some of the people on his expedition, they knew about the Native American tribes that they encountered along the way. And so later, subsequently, not that far after, this is important to Melungeon history in America and how it relates to your long-lost Cherokee grandmother that has some murky, how it connects to the Cherokees and Native Americans. Hear me out here. In 1559, Tristan de Luna, the De Luna expedition. This is very important. And once I found this, I was like, this is the missing link. There was a De Luna expedition. They attempted to settle Mobile Bay this is in Alabama near Pensacola in 1559. Have you ever heard about this in your history books? Why is this not in your history books? That in 1559, the Spanish attempted to settle North America. This was much larger than the Roanoke settlement. It was much larger than the Jamestown or Mayflower. You know, this was like 3 giant Spanish galleons loaded with material, horses. They brought women. They brought enslaved people. They brought probably, there was 1,500 people. They don't know the ratio of people that were enslaved and people that were Spanish. What happened is they were trying to settle at the mouth of Mississippi. They couldn't find the mouth of Mississippi because it's all swampy and, you know, marshland in the Delta. They went further to the east. They found Mobile Bay, the mouth of the Alabama River. So they said, okay, let's dock our ships there. This happened a lot with Spanish expeditions. They had horrible luck. Maybe it was God's providence, who knows. There was a hurricane hit, destroyed the 3 ships. The 3 ships sank in the harbor right after they got there. They tried to salvage as much as they could, but that was immediately a bad start to the colony. So they did as much as they could to salvage stuff from the ships and get everything off of there, food supplies and, you know, whatever could be salvaged to build stuff. And they knew that they were going to have a hard time going through the winter, and they were going to have to make it through the winter till a resupply ship could come from, Veracruz or something. And so they sent a reconnaissance of some of their soldiers. Oh, a bug just flew into my face there. They went up the Alabama River, they went up the Coosa River, they went all the way up to the Appalachian Mountains. Why would they do this? Somebody from the expedition must have been on the DeSoto expedition. They said, hey, let's go up there. There's some wealthier Native Americans up there that can help us out. Maybe we can ally with them and they can help us get through the winter. Because when they went up the Alabama Coosa Rivers, they discovered Native American towns and villages, but most of them were abandoned. They were decimated by European diseases at that time. And that's evidence of the 90%. And how does this relate to the Melungeons? They go up there. This is 1559, 1560 around. They create some sort of diplomatic relationships with the head Micos up there. They were probably Appalachia or Yuchi or Proto Creek tribes, and they were still okay, and they had relative to the ones closer to the coast. But probably when they went up there, they spread European diseases, and like the next winter, those Indians, Native Americans, were decimated by European diseases. But they helped them out to defeat a tribe that was next door over by Chattanooga. This is all documented by the Spanish. You can look this up. I'm not making this up. The Luna expedition is well documented, and they came back with some supplies from the Native Americans to get them through the winter. They made it to 1561, and they said, a lot of the Spanish, they were like, get us the hell out of here. We're tired of trying to set up this colony in North America. We want to go back to Mexico and Spain. The Spanish sent some rescue ships, but as often with these colonies, they didn't have enough room to take everybody. So probably what they did is they took the Spanish people and they left the enslaved people marooned there. If you talk to the Melungeon descendants in the Newman's Ridge, most of them say they were Portuguese and they were marooned here by a shipwreck. This feeds in exactly to what happened with the Luna expedition in 1560. Probably several hundred enslaved people. They weren't all African American. Some of them were Middle Eastern Islamic people. By DNA, it shows up in the Melungeons' DNA because the Spanish fought the Moors and they fought the Ottoman Empire, and not the Ottoman Empire, whatever the Islamic Empire was in North Africa at that time for the Iberian Peninsula. And there were people from the Middle East that were fighting that war, and they were enslaved, put on Spanish galleons along with Africans. The Portuguese started that, enslaving Africans, putting them on the transatlantic slave ships, and we know how that led to the enslavement and mass diaspora of African Americans to North America, but mostly to Central America. But also, these people intermarried that were marooned here. They intermarried with the indigenous tribes that survived the pandemic because their populations were depleted, and they created a strategic alliance. And these enslaved people that were marooned here, they didn't want to go back to Spain. They were like, we'll stay out here and live with the Americans, or Native Americans. But they knew how to build things. They knew how to build, because that's what the Spanish used for. They knew how to, they probably didn't know how to build ships. That's the problem. And that's why they were marooned there. They knew how to build houses, and they knew how to do metal, and they knew how to mine. And so a lot of the Melungeons were like miners, and some of the Native Americans mined stuff too. But this coincides with Oconostota. Oconostota was much later in the 1700s, he was a war chief for the Cherokees. Very important figure in Cherokee history. When John Sevier, later in Oconostota's life, after the Cherokee were defeated, around the time of the Revolutionary War, there was the Cherokee and American Wars. It was around the 1780, around there. Oconostota was living up by northeast Tennessee. And Sevier interviewed him and talked to him, and he said, they were trying to find this legend of the lost legend of Modoc, and Sevier was trying to find some justification for them stealing Indian land and saying that Europeans were there before the Native Americans. They had some claim. So he pressed Oconostota. He said, the Cherokees weren't always living in East Tennessee. They knew some of them came from the Erie, and they were to the Ricohawken. The Ricohawken were by the peaks of the Otter, which is western North Carolina, or western Virginia. Western Virginia, when Jamestown was founded, they besides the Powhatan Indians, which were near the coast, they encountered these Indians further towards the mountains called Ricohawken. Ricohawken is what the Dutch called them. Ricohawken's a Dutch term. The Dutch encountered the Iroquois. They encountered the Ricohawken. They were probably pushed south by the Iroquois during the Beaver Wars. They later merged with the Cherokees. The Cherokees were down by, and they became known as the Cherokees, but they weren't always known as the Cherokees until what I'm about to tell you. We're talking about Melungeon history and American history. Thanks for listening to me. I got the comments turned off. Oconostota tells the story. This is a Cherokee war chief, very important to Cherokee history. He tells the story from his parents and grandparents. Oconostota was probably born around 1700, 1710. In the 1600s, when the Ricohawken came down the Great Warpath, down towards Knoxville, and south of there is Valore, Tennessee. It's where Chota was. It was the capital of the Cherokee, the Overhill Cherokees. That's where Oconostota. He was the great warrior of Chota. They asked him. They said, what did your grandparents say? They said, we encountered these people. We called them the Moon-Eyed people. You can look this up in the Cherokee oral tradition. When they moved into that area of Tennessee, they encountered these people called Moon-Eyed people. They had poor eyesight, and they dug holes in the hills. What is that? They were miners. They encountered the Melungeon people. These are the remnants of the people that were stranded here from the DeLuna expedition. They were still there. There's other evidence they were still there in the 1670s, because there's the Arthur Wood had the Needham and Gabriel expedition. He sent explorers out with the Occaneechi. The Occaneechi were traders on the East Coast, and they would trade with the Cherokees. They were trying to cut them out as middlemen. They were trying to find a direct trading link to the Cherokees at that, they didn't know they were called Cherokees at the time. They were called different, even in their thing. They didn't call them Cherokees. They called them something else, because probably they were remnants of the Creeks and the Uchis. Their Occaneechi guide took them over the Blue Ridge Mountains, probably over into North Georgia, southern Tennessee, near Chattanooga, North Georgia, north of Atlanta. They encountered what they called Spanish people living in houses. They had beards. Native Americans don't have beards, or at least they didn't at that time. The Native Americans can grow facial hair. At that time, they would pluck it out. It was considered a fashion faux pas to have a big beard, just like if you're a banker now, Native Americans, they would pride themselves on their appearance, which is good. And they encountered these people with long beards. They were really hairy. That's not Native Americans. Well, besides, long hair, but, not like a lot of body hair. And they worshipped a book, which means they had writing, and they rung a bell. They had metalwork. They had guns, they had weapons, they had harquebuses, they knew how to make metal, they had trinkets and earrings. They also, Gabriel and Needham, they wrote in their journal that there was a black town. They said it was expansive. There was a large area of. They knew that African Americans were not indigenous to North America. They said there was a distinction. They weren't Indians. They were African Americans living in probably western North Carolina, North Georgia, and southeast Tennessee in the 1670s. Okay, and there was, when was St. Augustine founded? It's 1560. There's also something important that happened around this time too, 1560, that I left out. There was the Don Pardo expedition, again from the Spanish. This is 1566. They attempted to settle an area here St. Helena, the St. Helena colony. It was after the Luna expedition to the Luna colony. The Luna colony failed. The St. Helena lasted a little longer. Again, at the same time, the Spanish were attempting to create missions in Spanish Florida. They founded St. Augustine. St. Augustine was founded 1566, around there. St. Helena, it was around Paris Island, South Carolina, north of Charleston. This is well before Roanoke. This is well before Jamestown. The Spanish founded a colony called St. Helena. There's still an archaeological dig there. They kind of know where it's at. It's near Paris Island. There's a military Marines base there now. How does this relate to the Melungeons? Don Pardo attempted to build a road. The Spanish wanted him to build at least like a trail from St. Helena to Zacatecas. If you look on the map, that's a long way away. They didn't realize how far away they're from Zacatecas. They didn't realize they had to go across the Mississippi and across Texas all the way to Mexico. They thought it was much closer. At that time, the Spanish thought the Appalachian Mountains were an extension of the Sierra Madre Mountains in Mexico. They didn't realize the Mississippi cut it, and there was this big area of Texas in between there, and how vast the distances were. They didn't have good maps back then. And so Don Pardo attempted to, this is in 1566, attempted to build a road, and they built little forts sparsely staffed with Spanish soldiers. And what happened, the Native Americans took them out. And the Melungeons might have been a part of it, because the Melungeons didn't like the Spanish. Why? The Spanish enslaved them. That's how they got marooned here. And they didn't want the Spanish to get a foothold in North America. and here's the other thing. Some of the Melungeons might have been Sephardic Jewish people that were also part of the Spanish Inquisition. Another reason they didn't want to go back to Spain, and why this is the Melungeons' early history so not well documented, because they were hiding. They were not looking to be found. And they were trying to escape the Spanish Empire, and they were living out there with the Indians. So the Melungeons, we know they were there. We know they weren't Cherokee. We know that the Cherokee history and the Melungeon history intersect somehow, but it's very murky. And here's what I think happened, and this is my conjecture, my theory. This is not proven, and this is not true. I think that, okay, so let me look at my notes here. If you're just tuning in, welcome to Chicago here. We're talking about Melungeon history. I got the comments turned off, and we're just doing a little talk and walk in here so people can listen to this. Okay, so another interesting thing is in 1615. Okay, so there's a, and people know about this. You can look this up too. On a rock in Hooper's Bald in western North Carolina. Hooper's Bald is one of those Appalachian mountains that doesn't have trees on the top of it. There's a big rock up there, carved in the rock, and the early settlers discovered this hundreds of years ago. The Cherokees knew about this too, and it carved in a rock up on the top of this mountain. It has a date. It says 1615, pre-Darmos Casada. They think it's Ladino. Ladino is the Sephardic Spanish language that's pretty much extinct now. And it means in prayer we give, married September 15, 1615. It's carved in a rock. It's in European characters. They think it's authentic. They think it's true. They think in 1615, someone up in these mountains in western North Carolina carved in this rock in this Ladino language that they got married there, or it's just like somebody writing on a tree like Joni Loves Chachi with a heart. They think that's what it is, that it survived because they wrote it in the stone. And that's more evidence that there was these Melungeon people living there in the 1600s. In 1690, when the British first came over the mountains there, like with the Gabriel and Needham expedition, that was 1670, 1690. They came over the southern Appalachians there in North Carolina and northern Georgia. They saw smoke off in the distance. They asked their Cherokee Native American guides, they said, what are those smokes? They said, those are Spanish miners. They've been there. They're mining the mountains. There's evidence there's a town called Helen, Georgia. It's a nice little touristy town there. North of there's a valley where they found evidence of Spanish mining activity in the 1600s to 1600s. There's also North Carolina. There's another site. Now, the Native Americans did mine mica. The Creeks did mine mica, and they mined other things. But they even though there was a gold rush later, there was gold in North Georgia, and we didn't know that. And later there was a gold rush that was used to push out the Cherokees. We'll talk about that. But hey, we're talking about Melungeon history here. I got the comments turned off. I don't know if any of this is making sense, but let me keep going here. I'm giving this a try. I need to get this spiel down pat better here. So what I think happened was the Melungeons that were still surviving as a distinct ethnic group in the Appalachians in the late 1600s were eventually mostly conquered and decimated by the Chickasaw and the Cherokees that came from the west and pushed the remnants of them, the ones that survived. Probably most of them were probably conquered by the Cherokees that came down the Great Warpath, for the Rico Hawkins that came down from the peaks of the Otter that settled in Chota. Either the Melungeons had their town at Chota, or they had it further down towards northern Georgia. They must have like some towns down there, northern part of Georgia, where New Chota ended up being in the 1800s, the early 1800s, when they did the old Cherokee Nation, and they had to move south after they lost the Cherokee American Wars. But there's probably a lot of remnants of the Melungeon DNA that ended up in the lower Cherokee, which were by South Carolina. These were the Cherokee that were first encountered by the British in the Carolina colonies, Charleston and eventually Savannah. Indian traders like my ancestors encountered these Melungeon Cherokees that were the lower Cherokees. There was towns down in the extreme western part of South Carolina that were conquered during the War of 1812 around 1760. Those people became the core of the Melungeons that claim Native American ancestry, because it goes back to they assimilated over the period between 1760 and 1830, the Trail of Tears. So they had 70 years to assimilate. Some of them were considered U.S. citizens because they were more white than Native American. They were mixed blood. They assimilated. They dressed in European clothes. Some of them were pretty wealthy, but they strongly identified as Cherokee because they were lower Cherokee. Probably their mothers, the matriarchal Cherokees, they were important to the trade between the British and the Cherokees. They would trade for arms. The Cherokee would use the guns to defend themselves against the Creeks and the Chickasaws and their enemies, the Iroquois. And Oconostota was part of that war between the British and the Cherokees in the French and Indian War. They tried to build a fort there called Fort Prince George down in South Carolina. It was the Cherokees ended up destroying it, just like they tried to build a fort at Chota, and they just used the materials of the fort for their own town. The British destroyed all the Cherokee towns and some of the valley and overhill, or the mountain towns there in North Carolina in 1760. And so any evidence is now under lakes. They flooded all these valleys with lakes, just like where Chota is, where Oconostota is buried in Tennessee. There's giant lakes there, and that's where, underneath there, that's where all the Cherokee, Chota, and all the villages are on the Tennessee side. The same thing happened on the South Carolina side. So it's all underneath lakes. We can't even do archaeological digs. Like, the evidence is covered up literally by water. And so that's where the Cherokee and the Melungeon history intersects. The Cherokees must have encountered the Melungeons at a certain point. They must have had battles, and the Melungeons lost. And the men were probably killed off. The kids were probably adopted into the tribe, the ones that survived. And some of the women must have been adopted into the tribe too. And there is evidence of European and Middle Eastern and African women as being the core of the Melungeons, and they married with white European traders, and they became some of the mixed bloods. The Cherokees, by the time of the removal of the Trail of Tears in 1838, almost a quarter of the Cherokees were mixed blood, considered. They were a mestizo population. A lot of them were Christian, a lot of them were wealthy, and a lot of them owned slaves because they were part of the slave trade. The Rico Hawkins were used by the British to enslave other Native Americans. They would drive them to the coast. This happened in the 16 and 1700s. It's what Bacon's Rebellion is about. You can read about Bacon's Rebellion that happened in 1676. There was King's Philip's War. There was the Yamasee Wars. All those wars had to do with Native Americans being enslaved, and the Native Americans rising up and fighting against the European colonists to say, hey, stop this slave trade, or we're gonna and the South Carolina colony was almost destroyed during the Yamasee War. Did you ever hear about that in the history books either? And they you know, so the version of history we heard was the British history. In a nutshell, the Melungeons were marooned enslaved people from the Spanish cultures. They came here in the 1500s. They were marooned here in North America. They went up to the Appalachian Mountains. They kind of, you know, they didn't really mix well with the Native Americans until they were conquered by the Native Americans, and then they became mixed with the Native Americans and they became absorbed into their culture. And that's why there's so many white Americans in Appalachia that this history was lost. And over the generations, like my Appalachian Melungeon ancestors, they didn't get a good education. They didn't know American history. A lot of them didn't know how to read and write. A lot of them weren't allowed to go to schools because in the 1920s, there was a guy named Plecker, and they would put a little spot next to your name on the census if they thought you weren't completely white. This goes back to the one drop rule. And they did have a drop of black blood, but it came from the 1500s and it came from the Spanish Empire. And that's why so many people, they would claim Native American ancestry instead of, because they were afraid of being deemed as black, even though they looked white and they only had a drop of black blood. But every once in a while, a kid would pop out with dark skin and kinky hair. And the Melungeons know this. My Melungeon grandfather had coal black hair. His mother, who is the only link I have to real authentic Cherokee ancestry, she had coal black hair, dark skin, but she also had Melungeon ancestry. It wasn't just Cherokee. She wasn't full-blooded. She was the most mixed person in my ancestry. Her DNA has Middle Eastern, it has Sephardic Jewish, it has Native American, true Native American, it has African American, and it has Scottish, English, German, and it has Spanish. And we never thought of her. She has more in common with a Mexican mestizo person than an American, you know, from Scotland. You know, it's just amazing. You know, a typical colonial settler in Appalachia, Scots-Irish, and it's because they were marooned there, and then the Trail of Tears happened, and they were the ones that were assimilated, and they weren't tied as much to the true Cherokees, the true indigenous people that went to Oklahoma and the Qualla Band there in North Carolina. And this is why there's so many white Appalachian people that claim Cherokee ancestry. There's a group of people in southern Ohio called the Carmel Indians. Look into the Carmel Indians. I'm well aware of these people because I knew they were there when I was a kid. Because even in southern Indiana, there's some people related to these people. They claim Native American ancestry, but they're really Melungeons. But they came from South Carolina through North Carolina, through western Tennessee, through eastern Kentucky and western Virginia. They kept moving north by northwest until they got to Ohio. And they have some of the telltale markers of the Melungeons. They call them the Carmel Indians, but they're really Melungeons. They descend from these Spanish people that were marooned here, the Spanish enslaved people, mixed race, that at brief moments in their history mixed with Native Americans. And then when the Trail of Tears happened, they did not go to Oklahoma because they married white and they were assimilated, and they were able to, I don't want to say be grandfathered in. They flew below the radar. They flew below the radar, and that's why they didn't have good education, and they were very mistrusting of governments. I don't blame them for being very mistrustful of governments. When I talked to Cherokee genealogists, I talked to real Cherokee genealogists from Oklahoma, and they said, why didn't your Melungeon ancestors apply for the rolls back after the Trail of Tears? You could apply for the rolls to be enumerated in the Cherokee census and part of the Cherokee Nations, the one in Oklahoma. And because, it took me a long time to answer it. Number one, it was hard to be an Indian back then. They denied their ancestry at that time, and then it wasn't until later. It wasn't until, like, you know, in the 1960s and 70s when it became cool to have like Native American ancestry, that all these people are like, yeah, but if I talked to my my great grandmother, she didn't want to talk about it. You know, we're the ones that want to talk about it because we don't have to. We're not being ostracized because of our ancestry. They were, especially in the 1830s, you know, and I hope this makes sense. I hope I'm not offending anybody by doing this. I feel it's important. I need to organize my thoughts and write this stuff in a book. And we were talking about it this morning on TikTok. I wanted to give it an experiment to see if I could do a stream of consciousness narrative and try to explain it instead of, to me, it's easier doing this than writing a book. And I'm too, I don't have the commitment. And nobody reads books now, you know. I don't read books. My attention span's not long enough. It's hard enough to do this. But I'll leave you with some other interesting stories that I discovered over my research here. In 1730, there was this guy. He was a Scottish guy. His name was Alexander Cumming, and he was a strange character. Like when he was in England, even before he came to America, he had a dream where he would encounter the Native Americans and somehow use it to. He wanted to like claim lands in North America and like create an alliance with the Native Americans or something. But he actually did it. He came in 1725. He came to the colony of South Carolina, and he came to Charleston, or was it Savannah? I think Savannah was just started in 1730. Charleston was started in 1680. Alexander Cumming, he came there. He immediately hooked up with the British Indian traders at that time and said, hey, take me on the western trails. I want to go on a diplomatic mission with the Cherokees. So they took him. There was the Colonel Chicken and some, Eleazar Wiggin. I think Eleazar Wiggin, he was an Indian trader, and he took him all the way to western Tennessee, to Chota. It's south and east of Knoxville, between Knoxville and Chattanooga, up in the mountains there in extreme eastern Tennessee. That's where the largest concentration of overhill Cherokees were at that time, 1730. And that's where Chota, and that's where Oconostota was, the great warrior of Chota. Sir Alexander Cumming probably met a young Oconostota there who was probably a warrior at that time. He wasn't. It was these other guys, the other chiefs, Old Hop, and some of the other chiefs at that time. He probably encountered them. Alexander Cumming convinced the Cherokees, for trading purposes, to pick somebody to be what he called the Emperor of the Cherokees, which was stupid. The Cherokees, they were like, every town has a headman. We were a confederacy of all these. We're connected by ethnicity and language, but every man's their own man. No one's ruled by an emperor or king, And there were headmen. There was a social. Mainly the power relied on the women, the matriarchal women. Both the Creeks and the Cherokees are matriarchal societies, where you trace your lineage through the mother, and that's where the clan, CLA systems, the Cherokee clan system, the 7 clans, and the other, Shawnee have it. They have like 5, and I think the Creeks have clans as well. And of course, the Scottish guy, he's like, oh yeah, we have clans in Scotland. The clan McGregor, MacDonald, whatever. And so he convinced the Cherokees, and I think the British recognizes the Cherokees. It never was as big of a thing as the British thought it was. They picked a guy to be emperor of the Cherokees. It was probably some guy from Tellico there, Grand Tellico, and they marched back to the mountain towns and the lower towns, which are the ones that were already trading with, and they were separate tribes, that they convinced them all to recognize this emperor. And that's when Little Carpenter, Attakullakulla, he was young there at the time. They sent 7 Cherokee warriors over to England to meet King George I. And the reason they did that, the British were establishing diplomatic ties with the Cherokee Nation at that time to be proxies to defend the whole area west of the Appalachians from the French. The French claimed the Mississippi Valley. Every time I talk about, what time we got? 12:47. Every time I talk about the French, you know, the Joliet and Marquette, and I talk about La Salle and the Native Americans that showed them the way to get to the Mississippi portage from the Great Lakes, from the Quebec St. Lawrence Seaway, all over through the Great Lakes, down the Illinois, through Chicago, over to the Mississippi. They claimed this whole area for France. Of course, England didn't want France to claim all this. And so they used the Cherokees as proxies to fight the Native American tribes that the French were courting, which included the Potawatomi, which included the Illini Confederacy. Chief Chicago from the Illini Confederacy in 1725, he went to meet King Louis the 15th. He went to meet King Louis the 15th in France. And the 7 Cherokee warriors went to meet King George I in England. They used that. That's why in several outbreaks of wars, the French and Indian War, the Revolutionary War, the War of 1812, all those were Native American battles as well, where Native American tribes fought each other, and they fought the colonial empires through the tribes, the Tecumseh, all this other stuff. The Iroquois were involved in this, the Cherokee, the Creeks, the Choctaw, the Seminole, the Chickasaw, Shawnee were involved with this. And it was the battle for North America, and the Indians lost. And it's because European powers pitted them against each other, divide and conquer. The same thing they did to the Irish and the Scottish, they did it in the people in the Indian subcontinent in Asia. They did it to the Native Americans. The European powers were very good at this time of pitting the Native Americans against each other, and then get them to fight each other to decimate their warriors, and then they would come in and they would come in and get them from behind. You know, watch Braveheart. It was all part of the strategy. Sir Alexander Cumming convinced the Cherokees, and that's kind of when the Cherokee Nation, as we think of it, was kind of established. England kind of forced all these, and some of the Melungeons were part of that. Some of the Melungeons thought of themselves as part of the Cherokee Nation, but then over the subsequent decades, they assimilated and they became wealthy, especially the trading families, that they adopted European customs, including owning slaves. And a lot of the mixed bloods owned slaves by the time of the charioteers, and some of them brought their slaves with them to Oklahoma, the ones that stayed with the Cherokee Nations. A lot of them, my ancestors were split. The ones that were part of the Cherokee Nation that looked Native American, they went to Oklahoma. They died in Oklahoma. They fought in the Civil War, the Battle of Pea Ridge. There was 2 Cherokee divisions that fought under the Confederacy. Stan Wadey was the last surrendering general of the Confederacy. It wasn't General Lee. It was a Cherokee chief, and he was a true Native American. He wasn't a Melungeon, and he wasn't a mixed blood. He was Stan Wadey, you know, and just like Major Ridge. Major Ridge was a Native American, but he adopted European cultures and customs. He owned slaves. He owned a mansion that's still used for weddings in North Carolina. It's called Chieftains. He sold that during he was part of the Treaty Party, and that's why the people that weren't part of the Treaty Party of the Cherokees, they murdered him and his family because he betrayed the ones that didn't want to go to Oklahoma, and he sold his land, and he signed the treaty that they took the money, they took the buyout because they realized it was going to happen anyway. So they said, we might as well take the money, because if we don't take the money, it's going to happen anyway too. So we might as well get some money for it, because they were smart businessmen. But it's fascinating, the history. People with Melungeon, some of the Melungeons have very little Native American ancestry. Some of the Melungeons have significant Native American ancestry. It depends on if their ancestors were involved in the Indian traders. The Indian trader families, there's a higher chance you're going to have mixed blood, because your Indian trader, mostly European patriarch, probably married a Native American patriarch, but that Native American matriarch, the mother, that Native American matriarch was probably more mixed than you thought, because she had some Melungeon and she had some Native American, and that's why she was more assimilated. And that's why by the time of the Trail of Tears, some of them were living on the American side. They weren't living in the old Cherokee Nation, and they weren't rounded up, and they saw all the other Cherokees getting rounded up, and they didn't want to get rounded up either, so they went to the hills and denied their ancestry. And Melungeon was a pejorative, especially in the 1890s, the people that lived on Newman's Ridge and stuff, and it's because of white supremacy and the one drop rule, and people were like, they were afraid to let their kids marry and hang out with them because they thought their blood would be polluted by the Melungeon mixed heritage, you know. And that's why now it's kind of like a badge of honor, you know. And to me, it's a fascinating part of American history that we should discuss more, because I'm glad that people talk about the 1619 Project. They talk about the first enslaved people that were brought to the Jamestown Colony in 1619 from Mozambique, the western side of Africa, the coast there. Here, look at this turtle. But really, the first enslaved people that were brought to America, look this up. Push back me on this. The first enslaved African American people were brought to North America by the Spanish in North America, 1526. It was the AYLLO expedition. I don't know how to pronounce it. AYLLO, and it was in Georgia, and 100 enslaved people escaped to live with the Indians. They probably, some of them might be with the Lumbees. The Lumbees still live in North Carolina. They're a state recognized. They have struggled to get federal recognition because they're kind of a mixed blood group as well. And they might be with the Catawba. They could be with the Roanoke, the Lost Colony. You heard about the Lost Colony of Roanoke. Some of the Lost Colony of Roanoke might have ended up with the Melungeons and the Native Americans. You know, so that was 1580s. And I think we have to include at least a brief chapter about the Melungeons when we talk about the colonial history of America. We can't leave out this chapter, because there were non-indigenous people living in North America between 1526 and 1607, before the Jamestown Colony, before the Roanoke Colony. We can't leave that out of history. They were there. It's in our DNA. They didn't play a huge role in what America became, but it's a way of understanding early colonial history, and it's a way of understanding why so many white Appalachian Americans think their great-grandmother was a full-blooded Cherokee. And it's why the Cherokees, it frustrates them to win. They're like, not all these people can be Cherokee. Not that many people escaped from the Trail of Tears. It's because at the time of the Indian Removal Act, 1830, the Melungeons were living outside the boundaries of the old Cherokee Nation, and they were interspersed with white Scots-Irish families on the frontier, and there wasn't a lot of women on the frontier, and so a lot of frontiersmen, they married these Melungeon women, and all the Melungeon women thought they were Cherokee, because they were here when the Cherokees were here, and they were here before the United States was a country. This makes sense? I know I'm not seeing the comments here, but I thank everybody for sticking on. I hope this makes sense. I'll make sure I review the video to see if I got to make any corrections. I know I'm all over the place, but let's see if I left anything out here. I hope everybody had a good lunch here. I hope this was educational. I hope you have a good Friday here. We're in Chicago here. We're walking through Lincoln Park, and I'm just trying to work out my theory here. But still this day, you can go to Georgia, and there's a place called Fort Mountain State Park. There's a bunch of rocks that are, it looks like a fort at the top made out of a stone wall. When Sevier encountered that, when he was fighting Dragon Canoe and the Chickamauga were a offshoot of the Cherokees. They were Cherokee. They were a faction of the Cherokee that didn't want to do the peace treaty after the American Revolutionary War, the Cherokee-American Wars. After the American Revolution, from 1776 till 1794, the Cherokees fought an 18-year war against the Americans. Dragon Canoe was a part of this. Doublehead was a part of this. These are all Native American chiefs. They attacked Nashville. Nashville was a frontier town at the time. They attacked Knoxville. They attacked Chattanooga, Chattanooga wasn't even a town there. Chattanooga was part of the Cherokee Nation. That's where John Ross lived. And that was a trading post for the Cherokee. Sequoia himself, who came up with the Cherokee syllabary, probably was a Melungeon Cherokee Native American. He had true Native American ancestry, of course, I'm not denying that, but he also had some of this Melungeon in his ancestry. His father could have been George Gist, who was the son of Nathaniel. No, his father could have been Nathaniel Gist, who was the son of George Gist. George Gist saved George Washington's life during the French and Indian War. George Washington was going to fall through the ice in a river when they were crossing it, and George Gist saved his life. George Gist explored the Ohio Valley in the 1750s, one of the first European people to document the Ohio Valley from the British culture. But his son was Nathaniel Gist. He was a double agent during the Revolutionary War, and he had, just like Sam Houston, he briefly had Cherokee girlfriends and wives. Look at all these squirrels. And Sequoia's mothers thought to have had relations with Nathaniel Gist, and Sequoia would sometimes sign his silver work. He was a silversmith. Sequoia was the Cherokee that came up with the Cherokee writing system, the Cherokee syllabary, on his own, independently. It's the first time Native Americans independently came up with their own writing system, and Elias Boone and would use it for the Cherokee Phoenix, and the British didn't like that at all. They didn't like that the Cherokee could read and write in their own language, and they didn't understand it. And they, just like they didn't want to enslave people to read and write, But Sequoia his mother had Melungeon ancestry mixed with her Native American. Nancy Ward, one of the most beloved, she was a beloved woman of the Cherokee Nation. She was a very, very heroic figure in the history of the Cherokee Nation. There are several reasons. She probably had Melungeon mixed with Cherokee, and it goes back to, and that's why I think the Cherokee and the Creeks and the Chickasaw conquered the Melungeons, and that's why their history's lost, because they got absorbed into the Native American cultures before they encountered the British culture. There's I was going to say one more thing, and I lost it there. But that's where the Cherokees and the Melungeons intersect, and it's a fascinating. You could see some of the old chiefs. They would have, the Iroquois would do this though. They would do the silver in the earrings, but some of the designs, they think they're Sephardic in nature, which is interesting. There's a Sephardic Jewish element which comes from Spain. The Sephardic Jews are from Spain and North Africa. They're distinct from the Ashkenazi European Jews, and I'm not trying to get into, this is all documented. There's different ethnicities within different larger groups, subgroups, and I've learned this. This is why I won't even go there, but I know what I was going to say. There was a Irish Indian trader from the early 1700s. His name was Adair, and there's a whole lineage, famous lineage of Cherokee Native Americans, true documented Cherokee, that come from the Adairs, because he had a Chickasaw wife because he was an Indian trader and he had a Cherokee wife. This is Adair, and this is in the early 1730s. Adair wrote a book, and people never understood this book that he wrote in the 1730s. He was convinced that his Native American Chickasaw wife had some Sephardic Jewish heritage, and he wrote this in the 1730s, and everybody's like, "You're crazy." And he wrote about like the lost tribes of Israel. It almost sounds like the Book of Mormon, where he thought that the lost 10 tribes of Israel ended up in North America. But if you put it in the context of the Melungeons, it makes sense, because he noticed some of the cultural traits of his indigenous Chickasaw wife some things were very similar to the Sephardic Jewish traditions. And he's like, where did this come from? And if you put it in the context of the Melungeons, it makes perfect sense. And so that's why this whole thing, I've been doing this talk about the history of the Melungeons, and why so many white Appalachian Scots-Irish people think that their great-grandmother was Cherokee. It's because she has a little bit of Melungeon in there, and there's some truth in it. It's just much further back than you can imagine. And here's another way to look at it. I'll end it with this. My maternal great-grandmother, who we thought was Cherokee, and she does have some Cherokee, it's just much further back, and we didn't realize how much further back it was. So my great-grandmother's great-grandfather, he went on the Trail of Tears. I know his name. His name was James Conrad. He had a German surname. His name in Cherokee was Dalasene. His father's name was Dagosika. Dagosika his name was Herr Conrad. Herr Conrad led the first detachment of the Trail of Tears, and his father's name was Gunrod. Gunrod Conrad. His father's name was Johann Conrad. He came from Germany. He married a probably mixed blood Cherokee woman in the 1730s. She probably had Melungeon heritage. She was considered a Cherokee matriarch from the lower Cherokees in the South Carolina side, not the Tennessee side, the South Carolina side of the Cherokees. This is in they probably got married around 1730. She's well documented. Emmett Starr, who writes the genealogies of the Cherokees, talks about her name was Jeannie Aniwaya. What's Aniwaya? That means the wolf clan of the Cherokees. Gunrod's documented. When the Moravian missionaries went to visit, they were trying to convert the Cherokees to Christianity around 1800. They had a mission. They speak about Gunrod. They talk about him like he's mixed race. They said he's a friend of the British and the Cherokees. He's a friend of the white man and the Indian. He was a mixed blood. Gunrod was a mixed blood. His mom was probably Cherokee. His dad was a German Indian trader that came with the British. He's documented. His name was Johann Conrad was killed probably before the war, the French and Indian War. Jeannie Aniwaya, the mother of Gunrod, her second husband was a British guy who built Fort Prince George. The British came, so she was, even in 1750, she was assimilated. Some of her offspring with this British guy later became Cherokee chiefs in Oklahoma. Not only that, Gunrod is the uncle of Charles Renatus Hicks. Who's Charles Renatus Hicks? He was the first mixed blood chief of the Cherokees. He died. He died under weird circumstances in the 1820s, and he was probably a Melungeon mixed blood Cherokee. His mother was the sister of Gunrod, and goes back to Jeannie Aniwaya. So I only have, you got 8 great grandparents. You got 64 great. If all your great grandparents, all their great grand, you got 64. Only one of my 64 great grandparents went to Oklahoma. The other one, James Conrad, he had multiple wives. James Conrad fathered about 40 kids with about 4 different women. Some of those women he was having kids with at the same time. This was not atypical at the time of the Trail of Tears. Many of the wealthier mixed blood, the ones that owned slaves, they were polygamous at the time of the Trail of Tears, and some of them also owned slaves. This is black people that lived in the old Cherokee Nation, and that's why the woman that my Melungeon Cherokee grandmother came from, it was not a formal marriage. There was no documentation, and so she was much more assimilated than he was. And when the Trail of Tears happened, she simply went and lived with her white ancestors, or her white relatives. And that's how she escaped the Trail of Tears. And we find her on the census. We find all these women in the 1840 census I can show it to you. In the 1840 census in western North Carolina, there's all these woman household families with lots of kids. And they all got little marks next to their name, because they would put marks next to their name if they thought they weren't white. They did this with the Melungeons, and sometimes they would list them as mulatto, sometimes they'd list them as white, and it was right near the Qualla boundary. Their last name was Conrad, and the Oconaluftee Visitor Center, when you go into the Cherokee side of the Great Smoky Mountains, there's a visitor center, and the Conrads have a corn crib there. They were there. They were in Little Cataloochee. There was a lot of Melungeon communities around there. Bryson City, which is in western North Carolina, in the 1930s, during the Great Depression, you ever see that picture of the migrant mother with, the classic picture of the migrant mother? She's in the back of the car there with the kids huddled there. She was probably a Melungeon descendant, but that same photographer that took that picture of that woman, migrant mother, also has some of you see them all over the internet. There's the last documented pictures of the Melungeons that were Caucasian looking people that lived in the Appalachians, that had dark skin, had dark hair, and they got pictures. She's got pictures of them. They're black and white. But there's one picture where there's a woman washing. It's called Sunday, because Sunday would be the day you wash the clothes, or Monday would be the day you wash the clothes after Sunday, I guess. Is that what it was? Or maybe Saturday. It was wash day, and she's on a wash floor. It's a Melungeon woman from Bryson City, North Carolina. A lot of Melungeons ended up in that area because they were there in that area for hundreds of years before that. They were there before the Rika-Haken got there. They were absorbed into the Cherokee tribe, and when the Trail of Tears happened, they hid, they denied their ancestry, and the other European settlers kind of ostracized them and called them Melungeons. And they didn't want them to go to church together. They didn't want their kids to marry them, and a lot of them didn't go to school. And you can trace the Carmel Indians of Ohio to these people. A lot of people in eastern Kentucky, they ended up migrating to that area. The Newman's Ridge in Tennessee, that's the surnames associated with those Melungeons are Collins, Gibson, Mullins, and Goins, G-O-I-N-S. And those are well-documented Melungeon families. When they researched their DNA, there was much more African American than Native American. They were surprised because all those families claimed Native American. They had no idea they had African American ancestry. It goes back to the Melungeons. I know there's a lot of theories that there was, and this is part of the Melungeons too, we have to acknowledge this. Some of the Melungeons come from mixed race unions in colonial America during the indentured servant period, where indentured servants in Jamestown and the early Virginia colony, before Bacon's Rebellion, before it was included in the law, there were mixed race unions of usually white women with black men that were indentured servants, not slaves at that time, because not everybody was enslaved before Bacon's Rebellion. They were indentured servants, even some of the people of color, and that's how we get large amounts of free people of color that existed throughout the South and East Coast before the Civil War. Some of those go from the same mixed race unions from the indentured servant pre-Bacon Rebellion, but some of those people went to the Appalachians, and they went to live out with the Indians because they didn't want to stay in Tidewater, Virginia, and become 12 years a slave. You know, you were always, if you were mixed race in colonial Southern America, you had a hard time if you were a free person of color, and this included Melungeons, Native Americans, after the Trail of Tears, it was hard to be a Native American east of the Mississippi. And we know the sad history of America. We got to talk about it. Thanks for listening. I appreciate it. Thanks for dealing with the no comments. I had to do it this way because otherwise I would get distracted, and I went to do a constant stream of narrative. I hope this made sense. I'll try to get this thing down. We'll work on it so I can actually have an hour-long talk where I can more directly create a better historical narrative for people to understand. I hope this is helpful. If you got any questions, write in the comments. If you disagree with anything I said, you can put a comment to this video and we can talk about it. I'm happy to talk about it. I don't know everything. Sometimes I get things wrong. Sometimes I learn things by people writing the comments, things I left out, how it relates to your family. You might have information that I don't have, and we'll be happy to include it and expand upon this. Well, have a great rest of your Friday. I'm going to go back to work here. Thanks everybody for tuning in, and we'll probably do a TikTok live tonight. I don't know if I'm going to do the Great Smoke Out because you got to pay money to go into it, like $70 to $130. I would like to do it, but I'm not, you know, I wasted a bunch of money on NASCAR. I wasted a bunch of money on Lollapalooza. So I might just do the Gospel Festival if I do anything. The Gospel Festival is going on in Grant Park. I think it's free on Saturday. But I was just, you know, I was downtown yesterday. That's why I worked from home today, so I don't have to go downtown every single day. People like you downtown all the time. But hey, thanks mods. Thanks for letting people know what was going on here. And I'm going to get back to work. Have a great day, everybody. From Chicago. Thanks for listening about the Melungeons. If you missed any part of this, you can rewind and watch it from the beginning. Hopefully it'll make more sense. I'll learn from, I'll try to make this better the next time I do it. This was like the practice run. Thanks everybody. Thanks for tuning in. Have a great day, and we'll talk to you tonight here on TikTok. Thanks a lot. That's great.